Okay, well, my name's Alex Stevens. I'm Professor in Criminal Justice at the University of Kent, and I was the lead author of the Advisory Council on the Misuse Drugs report on reducing opioid deaths in the UK.
Alex, you're here today because we're having a conference to mark International Overdose Awareness Day. And the two other important pieces of context, I suppose, in Scotland, sadly this month we've again reported record numbers of overdose deaths in Scotland, and a 23% or so rise on those. And at the same time we have an indication from government that there'll be a refresh of the existing Road to Recovery strategy. So I suppose my question is, reflecting on what you've been talking about this morning, what's your comment on that? Where should drug strategy be going? What are the challenges and what are sort of evidence-based responses?
Sure. Well, as you say, we've got record numbers of deaths in Scotland, but we've also got record numbers of deaths across the UK. And each of those deaths is a tragedy for the individual and for the families concerned. And the fact they keep on growing is of huge public importance. That public importance, I think, is being neglected by the politicians and others who've got the responsibility to do something at national level about this national problem. And I think it's even more tragic given that we have very good evidence on how we could reduce these deaths. We have some idea of what the causes of the increased deaths are, but we have really good evidence on how we could reduce them. And that involves primarily engaging people in opiate substitution treatment of optimal dosage and duration, and that was the main recommendation of the ACMD's report on reducing opioid-related deaths.
And that's in that sense, when people question whether treatment works and ask us to define treatment and the word works, we're actually not delivering treatment that would work if it's suboptimal.
I think there's some good practice, but there's a lot of ways in which we're damaging the effectiveness of treatment. One of those is that we're not providing adequate dosage. So therapeutic doses of methadone, for example, normally over 60 milligrams. In too many cases, people are getting below that, either because they're not prescribed up to the level they need, or because they're being encouraged to reduce their dose to levels that are below the therapeutic dose. Another way we're damaging the effectiveness of treatment is by encouraging people to leave before they're ready. So if we impose arbitrary goals on people towards recovery and abstinence before they're ready to achieve that abstinence, before they've got all the things in their life they need to be able to support that abstinence, such as stable housing, employment, good relationships, good connectedness to their communities, if people are encouraged to finish opiate substitution treatment before they're ready, they're very likely to relapse, and that makes them incredibly vulnerable to dying. And there's certain ways in which treatment practices have been changed both in Scotland and England that encourage people's dosage being too low and the duration of their treatment being too short, which is why the ACMD recommended that there should be investment in opiate substitution treatment of optimal dosage and optimal duration. And that optimality is dependent on the patient's need at the time, based on the relationship they have with their doctor.
And in terms of the quality of the service, there's that sort of narrow definition of good practice around OST, but there's also that question of, and somehow the recovery agenda didn't make this clear, was that, you know, in a whole person approach, actually we would be addressing those things as well, so you wouldn't be sorting out your housing or your relationships with your family in abstinence, you'd be sorting them out during your engagement with treatment, and it's part of treatment's duty to begin that journey with you.
Yeah, I think too often harm reduction and recovery have been talked about as if they're in opposition to each other, as if you either do one or the other. Either you reduce the harm people experience, or you encourage them to recover. But the two have to go together, because unless people are alive, they can't recover. People's harms they're doing to themselves and to their communities is part of the recovery process. So we need to bring these two wings of the drug treatment movement together to find points of connectedness around care for people and their dignity in ways that put the person at the centre of the treatment process to identify what their needs are and how they can best be supported.
And if we had a consensus around what was good practice around methadone and the new guidelines around which should help, if that was uncontested, then treatment services might be able to pause and think about what more they could offer, and what they could offer in partnership with other agencies and with families and with other stakeholders as appropriate.
Yeah, we have an ideological contest which was within the field, and we need to address that. I think we've also got a problem of the social and economic context within which we're working, and the political context. So we're talking about a group of people, the most vulnerable people tend to be living in the most deprived areas of our countries. Their poverty is being increased deliberately by a government that's using destitution as a deliberate form of punishment of people for not conforming to the norms that they see as appropriate. We're talking about a political climate of austerity in which cuts are being made to welfare services, local authority services, and specifically to drug treatment services. So yes, we need to sort out our disputes within the field, but we also need to make a case together that this is an important group of people who deserve to have their human rights and dignity protected by adequate investment in the welfare, social support and treatment services that they need.
And in a local political context, if you like, in Scotland, we have our government's been keen to differentiate what we're doing here away from the UK government. So even in terms of welfare, where we have devolved powers around that, there's a bill currently being drafted around doing something a little different in Scotland. And it would be possible around that to identify some of those stigmatisation of poverty and people living in areas of deprivation through your drugs policy.
Yes, but I think it also goes the other way.
Yeah.
My argument is always that drug policy is only one small part of what affects the lives of people who have problems with drugs. And the impact of social and economic policies tends to be much larger, because that's what tends to get people to the point of having a drug problem in the first place. In communities which have good connectedness, very little poverty, strong education services, good social housing, you see far less problematic drug use. So if we could have social and economic policies that support connectedness and fulfilling lives, then we wouldn't need to focus so much on what treatment we're going to provide to people, because they wouldn't be in need of that treatment in the first place.
Yeah, which is where we are at the Scottish Drugs Forum. That wider context has always been important in terms of our public discourse. Thank you for that. And one takeaway, and this is maybe unfair to put you on the spot because it never comes down to one thing, but in terms of the content of the thrust of policy, what should we be looking at?
Well, I think there's obviously a number of things. So in the ACMD report, we recommended that drug consumption rooms should be considered in places which have high concentrations of injecting drug use. We talked about expanding the availability of naloxone. We talked about having heroin-assisted treatment available to people for whom methadone has not worked. But the primary recommendation we made to national and local governments was they need to invest in opiate substitution treatment of optimal dosage and duration.
Alex, we'll work away at that, I'm sure.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.